Well, the implications of this annual conference are enormous every year. But this one in particular, with the Arab Spring and also recent new partnerships in the Middle East and an overall changing mood. There is so much that can be said about all of this, of course, and certainly there are some strong opinions on all sides. Well, to give us a few of those opinions, I'm joined here in studio by Dan Pollak, co-director of government relations for the Zionist Organization of America, and in our New York studio, Norman Finkelstein, political scientist and also author of This Time We Went Too Far, Truth and Consequences of the Gaza Invasion. And, you know, as we start this discussion, I think it's going to be important to clarify a few different things. Now, when it comes to Middle East peace, and Dan, I will start with you, what is acceptable? Are you willing to negotiate, and what would you be willing to give up or give in on?
Well, to begin with, I work for an American organization, not the Israeli government. But the Israelis are extremely anxious to have peace. At this AIPAC conference, about all they talk about is peace and how it should be achieved. So peace is the ultimate objective of everyone I know in Israel, on both sides of the political spectrum. The problem is about what the conflict is really about. And the United States, in formulating issues relating to territory, is not getting to the core issue. The core issue, in my view, and probably in the view of most Israelis, is the inability of the Arab world and the Palestinians to accept the very existence of a Jewish state in the midst of the Middle East. And until that issue gets satisfied, all the talk of potential border resolutions and all the other things that are being focused on really don't get us towards that end of peace.
And I think President Obama even mentioned that in his speech at AIPAC yesterday, that it is absolutely, you know, essential that people from Israel are negotiating with others who recognize them. However, on the other side of that, people in Palestine think the same thing. They want to be recognized as their own state, and they don't feel like they are. So, Norman, I'll have you speak to that, you know, the recognition of what each side is.
The basic principles for resolving the conflict have been put forth repeatedly by the international community, whether it be the International Court of Justice in July 2004 or the United Nations General Assembly in annual resolution. The terms are straightforward. There has to be a two-state settlement on the June 1967 border, Israel exercising sovereignty and independence within its state, and the Palestinians exercising sovereignty and self-determination in the whole of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem as its capital. And there also has to be a just resolution of the Palestinian refugee question. Those are the terms. Now, Ken has added a new term. He says that Israel has to be recognized as a Jewish state. But there's no basis for that in international law. And in fact, your listeners have to remember, this is not the first time Israel has attempted to settle its conflict with its neighbors. They have a peace treaty with Egypt. It was signed in 1979. They have a peace treaty with Jordan. It was signed in 1994. In neither case, if you read the texts of these peace treaties, in neither case is there any mention of recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. Mr. Pollak is simply pulling this rabbit out of the hat, another means to sabotage a resolution of the conflict on the basis of the law.
I'll let you respond to that, Dan.
I really couldn't disagree more with several points. First of all, the international law that applies here is UN Resolution 242, which does not require that all of the disputed territory of what Israelis call Judea and Samaria, and what Dr. Finkelstein called the West Bank, be given to the Palestinians. In fact, it's disputed territory. The Palestinian negotiating ploy seems to be what's yours is negotiable and what's mine is mine. As he said, in its entirety, everything has to be part of the Palestinian state. In fact, that is precisely what needs to be negotiated. And it is the Arab side who has steadfastly refused to enter into negotiations, direct negotiations, that could lead to any kind of peaceful resolution. So he's wrong about the international law that applies. The General Assembly does not determine international law. So the fact that they say that Jerusalem should be the capital of the Palestinian state...
But don't you think, Dan, when you say that the Palestinians have said that they're not willing to give anything, I mean, we saw with the Palestinian papers, we saw with a lot of different things that have happened and have come out in the last few months, that in fact, at least the Palestinian leaders have been willing to put just about everything on the table when it comes to negotiating, and there's just a few things that they've asked for from Israel that don't seem to be, no one seems to be budging on.
Well, actually, those papers were transcripts of the Palestinian side of negotiations from several years ago. And there's two important facts to know about that. First of all, they haven't put anything on the table. They haven't agreed to even sit down with the Israelis and discuss things through the vast majority of the Obama term. But secondly, the reason those Palestinian papers made such news is that the Palestinian negotiators have been withholding these very negotiating positions from their own people. And in fact, they disavowed them and still claim to this day that those very concessions about allowing some Jewish neighborhoods in Jerusalem to remain under Israeli control, they denied that they ever made such concessions. Now, I would be very pleased if a Palestinian negotiating team would return to the table with Israel and start negotiating on whatever basis, and I would be pleased if they would actually observe the agreements they've made in the past, which require them to stop incitement against the Jewish state. And finally, I would be pleased if they would choose peace instead of the Fatah-Hamas agreement, where they've just made an agreement over the last 2 weeks with Hamas, which is a terrorist state as defined by the European Union and the United States, a terrorist entity, and not helpful neither to American diplomacy in the region nor the prospects of peace.
And we should mention that Hamas and Fatah are meeting in Moscow to talk about this, and it is not, Hamas is not called a terrorist organization by everyone, not by Moscow and not by the United Nations, I believe. But still, Moscow has asked Hamas, and I'll let you get in here in just a second, Norm, but I mean, let's talk about what's going on here. Moscow has asked Hamas consider recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. Does this have to happen? And if it does happen, what would be the result? Norm.
Well, I think there are three things to be said. First of all, as I mentioned a moment ago, there is no precedent in international law, and there's no precedent in the peace treaties Israel has already signed with Egypt or Jordan for recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. Number two, everybody talks about what Hamas has to do, but what about what Israel has to do? The very same day, last Friday, when President Obama delivered his speech on the Middle East, the New York Times ran a large op-ed by the Deputy Speaker of the Israeli Knesset, who also happens to be a senior member of the Likud party, Mr. Netanyahu's party. Now, bear in mind, the Likud is the most moderate element of Netanyahu's coalition. So we're not talking about extremists like Avigdor Lieberman. We're talking about the moderate Likud. And in the op-ed, Danny Danon, the senior member of Likud, he put forward his vision, the Deputy Speaker of the Israeli Knesset, his vision for resolving the conflict. He said Israel should annex all of the Jewish communities, as he calls them, the illegal Jewish settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, all of what he calls the uninhabited areas of the West Bank, and he says, we will let the Palestinians in the main towns of the West Bank have independence, which means Israel will annex 97% of the West Bank, and the Palestinians in the main towns, that is to say 3% of the West Bank, they can have independence. Now, bear in mind, that's the vision of the most moderate element of Netanyahu's coalition. And yet everybody says or tells Hamas what it must do.